Hey everybody, welcome to Cut, Transform, Glue, and let's keep going with the Greeblie Hunter project, beginning with the legs, of which I already have some geometry and size ideas. The material of choice to begin building the segments this time is acrylic, which is super robust and that I've been trying to incorporate in my builds more frequently. To achieve a certain thickness, I began gluing a couple of pieces together using CA glue. Then, using an acrylic disc as a guide, I marked the rounded corners and made them on my mini disc sander. At this point, I also began drilling some holes to create the joints, and on my collection of Greeblies, I grabbed this black wheel from a dead printer and attached a couple of 3D printed shapes. I constantly get questions about how I keep my builds clean and precise, and the real answer is that I try to measure and mark before gluing or removing features. To be honest, this can be really time consuming, but I think the result pays off. As you can see, the acrylic I'm using is foggy, and that's because I always sand it before working with it, because otherwise it would be harder to see the markings and keep the precision. This is also why I add multiple coats of primer on the build process. I need to be able to clearly see what I'm working with. Now on this leg design, I'm trying a simpler way of connecting each segment, going in and out on each joint. This is something that I don't usually do, but that speeds up the build process a lot. From there, I added lots of detail pieces on the legs like dead laptop keycaps, some interesting acrylic shapes, and even some older urethane resin Greeblies that I cast in the past, and this was the result. You can also spot some resin printed pieces I glued on the top of the acrylic, adding even more thickness to the leg segments and some cool, precise little details. But then I had the idea of adding some smaller tanks on the side of the legs, using one of my favorite Greeblies, a Kinder Egg capsule. I 3D modeled and printed a precise holder for it on my Ender 3S1. I did some finishing and sanding of the piece, and I added a 3mm PVC pin on the holder. I also added some cool Greeblies to the capsule itself, one on each end, and then I glued it on the inside of the 3D printed holder ring. Of course, then I made a matching hole on the outside of the leg segment and I primed every piece. I was very happy with the result and I really loved the overall silhouette of the robot, but of course it is still missing the fit, so yeah, let's work on it. Okay, so I went shopping for some cool pieces for the feet and found some very interesting shapes, like this piece from a DVD reader, this white plastic ring right here with an array of holes on it, and this last Greeblie right here. Leave me a comment below if you know the source of this one. It is a pretty common thing we all use every day. Using double-sided tape, I attached the blue Greeblie onto a piece of wood and sanded some features off of it. The idea is to increase the surface area of the blue piece so CA can do a better job attaching it to the bottom shape. As always, this is a 3D printed piece with a slot in the middle for an M4 nut, so I can later grab it from the bottom and secure the robot onto the diorama base using a bolt. I also did some sanding of the top of the blue piece, and right there I attached the white shape. Now this time, instead of 3D printing a ball for the ball joint of the ankle, I actually decided to use a bead from my collection of beads. And to securely attach it on the top of the foot, I use a small piece of 3mm steel rod just to make sure it is sturdy enough. On the back of the foot, I'll try to create some sort of a heel. So I begin by gluing some simple joint pieces that can swivel up and down. And the heel piece will be this white mystery Greeblie right here, of which I remove some unwanted features. But as you can see on the 3D printed sole piece, let's say, I included some indentations all around, and I kind of want to do the same thing to the mystery Greeblie. In order to do that in a precise manner, I decided to quickly put together a simple jig using some leftover pieces of plywood I had lying around. The idea is to find a way to precisely divide and cut the indentations nice and aligned to each other. Simple jigs like this are very helpful for these kind of repetitive tasks. Let me know in the comments if you liked this idea. But anyways, the only thing left to do was the ankle, and the solution was a couple of 3D printed pieces that are held together by some 2mm steel rods. I of course threw a coat of primer on the pieces, and now every part of the leg is complete. Next came the last big structures I still needed to create for the Greeblie Hunter, the vacuum cleaner pieces. In order to make my life easier on the painting process, I try to always keep the pieces as separated as possible. So right here, for instance, I kept the fan separated from its housing, and I decided to attach the next structures underneath it. In my collection of Greeblies, I found this black disc which had the exact same radius as the bottom of the fan housing, so I decided to begin by attaching the fan on it. As you can see, I added this pink ring right here in between the pieces to create a pressure fit of the fan onto its housing. Then I grabbed some interesting Greeblies and began creating some structures under the black disc. I needed to make two main structures, one pointing to the back where I could attach the vacuum hose and one pointing down for the Greeblie tank. The one you're watching right now is what's going to be holding the hose, so this is why I'm including a nut on these acrylic pieces. The hose, by the way, is this transparent one I found online for a reasonable price that looks much better than the black electric tubing I was using. It is going to be connected to this black pivoting Greeblie that I'll bolt to the back. It is so funny that I always feel some sort of discomfort when I have to buy pieces for a project. People seem to have a negative opinion about 3D printing pieces, which by the way I have to conceptualize, 3D model and test fit, which involves some skill. To me that sounds much more interesting than buying something off the shelf, so I try to keep that to a minimum like the hose. I'll be honest, I wish I could 3D model and print a transparent, good looking hose, but I digress. I then found that black Greeblie which opens in half and have the precise measurement of the hose, which by the way I bought without knowing the gauge. What a magical moment. The idea is that that structure keeps the hose up and away from the leg. I couldn't be happier with the result, but now let's focus on the last big shape, the Greeblie tank. So I had this clear sphere in my collection for a while and I decided to use on the tank. My idea is to keep it transparent so we can see the Greeblies from the outside, making for a fun and interesting scene. But the sphere alone was too small for the job, so I chose a couple of extra Greeblies. I made some changes to it, removed some volumes here and there and sanding them pretty well to increase the surface area. I also made a big hole right here with a hole saw so the tank is like a single tube and not two separate chambers. Probably not a super important step, but I made it anyways. A couple of interesting 3D printed rings on each side just so I could precisely create a connection to the clear sphere halves. Priming and painting coats will make sure this is a pressure fit by the end of the build. And the last quick addition was some small fake Lego pieces. I was going to use bolts in there, but that is just much faster and the tank is complete. This is a very exciting moment now that every main structure of the Greeblie Hunter is complete and the build process is almost 100% done. Now if you're another subscriber, you know what's coming, the final detail pass. So let's go for it. So as you just saw, at that point the idea is to add the last final details that will make the model really stand out. So I'm just using the tiniest and most good looking Greeblies I have. For this particular one, I made a very robust connection using a 3mm steel rod and a brass piece with a matching hole. So if anything or anyone bumps onto it, it has a chance of surviving. I went ahead with that detailing process, adding as much detail and wires as possible, but keeping some empty areas with some big shapes like the flat aspect of the top or even the roundness of the fan housing. It is really important to create a balance on the design. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode of this build, and if you wanna go one step further and help me keep going, check my Patreon page, the link is on the description box. And as always, thanks for watching.